and welcome to the Tampa Bay History Center. My name is Rodney Kite Powell, and I'm the director of the Touch and Map Library here at the History Center. We are thrilled to have you all here for the last Florida Conversations of our 2021-2022 season, featuring these fine gentlemen right here, Dr. Boyd Murphree and Dr. Robert Taylor. We'll get to them in just a moment, but first I would like to thank our sponsors. Tonight's program is made possible with the generous support of AARP Florida, the Tampa History Center Endowment Fund at USF, and USF Libraries, WSF Public Media, who provided media support. Also, locally, joining us tonight and greeting you guys as you came in the room, those of you who are here in person, were members of the History Center's Teen Council. This group has expanded to represent 12 schools across 3 counties over the past 5 years that we've had a Teen Council. And the Teen Council helps us with events like this and lets students share their love of history outside of the classroom. In particular, we'd like to thank the two young people who were here greeting you all, Quinlan and Amara, for volunteering here tonight. And also, for those of you who are out there in Zoom land watching this live, we do have closed captioning, courtesy of AARP Florida. And that is available through your Zoom meeting controls. So if you need closed captioning, you can do it through that Zoom control. And also, please remember, for those who are watching at home or wherever you might be, to use the Q&A feature in Zoom to share your questions at any point during the presentation. Those of you here, do it the old-fashioned way. Just raise your hand and ask a question, and we'll be happy to answer it. Though we will, when we do Q&A at the end, want to wait and have you guys have speak into the microphone before you ask your question. So we'll take care of all of that. Last bit of housekeeping, we do want to talk about a couple programs we have coming up. We have a lot of events for the rest of spring and into the summer. All the events are available for you to see on our website, tampabayhistorycenter.org. But in particular, I want to mention 2 events that are coming up. May 21st from 11 to 5 up in Brooksville at Chinsegat. We are having a Florida Emancipation Day event. And so it's an all-day event. We're talking about celebrating Emancipation Day, of course, that day in May of 1865, when the enslaved people in Florida found out that they were at that point free. And so there will be some lectures, tours of the Chinsegat Manor House, a choir, concerts, and a lot of other things. So it's a great event that I hope everybody can come out and enjoy. Again, that's May 21st from 11 to 5 up at Chinsegat Hill. And then June 23rd at 6:30, we are holding our Duck Wall lecture here in this room and available via Zoom. And that lecture features Dr. Gary Mormino, who is actually in the audience today. And he will be talking about his new book, Dreams of a New Century, really a look at the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And so obviously a lot had happened in those 2 decades, and so we're here, Dr. Mormino, talking about that. So on to this evening's presentation. We have with us the editors of this book, The Governors of Florida. Dr. R. Boyd Murphree, to my immediate left, is project manager at the University of Florida George A. Smathers Libraries. Prior to his time at UF, he was the archivist for the State Archives of Florida and former assistant editor for the Papers of Abraham Lincoln Project. To his left is his co-editor, Dr. Robert Taylor, who is Associate Dean and Head of the School of Arts Communication and Professor of History at Florida Institute of Technology. And they put together this really amazing book consisting of 50 governors of Florida, from Andrew Jackson to Rick Scott, although you guys did get Governor DeSantis in there at the very end because he was elected when this book was just coming out. That just shows how long the project was. I think maybe Governor Martinez may have been governor when you guys started this project. But of those 33 contributors, several of them, including Dr. Murphree and Dr. Taylor, some of them are local historians or kind of folks you would have heard about. Of course, Canner Brown, James Denham, Gary Mormino, and Darrell Paulson. And for some crazy reason, they also let me contribute a chapter in the book as well. So today you will hear about really none of the Tampa area governors, although there were 3. There was Henry Lawrence Mitchell, who is actually the governor that I wrote about, Doral Carlton, and our own Bob Martinez, who is also in the audience. And so we do want to recognize Governor Martinez for being here. and probably could get a question in on Dr. Martinez, or excuse me, Governor Martinez by the time this is all over with. But in particular, Dr. Murphree is going to talk about Governor John Milton, who was in office during the Civil War, and Governor Sidney Catts, probably my favorite governor for kind of odd reasons, who was Florida's prohibitionist governor. And then Dr. Taylor will actually talk about three governors who served sequentially. Dan McCarty, Charlie Johns, and LeRoy Collins served during the 1950s into 1961 during a very tumultuous time in Florida history. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Murphree to start us off.
Thank you, Rodney. It's great to be here. Appreciate everybody here tonight, and those of you out there in Zoom land, thank you as well. I want to give special thanks to Governor and Mrs. Martinez for being here tonight. Governor Martinez contributed the foreword to this book, and when I asked him to do so, of course, he didn't know who I was, and I guess he took a leap of faith, as we often have to do sometimes, and we're very pleased with the outcome, but we really appreciate his contribution to the book. And as Rodney mentioned, his own contribution writing on Governor Mitchell, and Gary Mormino writing on Millard Fillmore Caldwell. So it's great to have them here tonight. As Rodney mentioned, I'm going to speak a little bit about Governor John Milton, who was governor during the Civil War. He came into office in October of 1861 and served until his death right before the war ended on April 1st, 1865. I'm also going to talk about Governor Sidney Johnson Catts, who was governor during the First World War from 1917 through the war and then until 1921. And the reason I chose these two governors, I guess I should have thought about speaking about governors from Tampa, but the reason I chose these two governors is, number one, I have a long research relationship with Governor Milton, if you will. That's kind of the impetus for my interest in the Florida governors. When I worked at the state archives, we had a portion of his papers there, and I got interested in him, and so the interest in the governors on my part developed through studying his career. And then, of course, Sidney Johnson Catts, one of the most colorful governors of all of our governors. Yeah, you could spend, I'm sure, a whole class talking about Katz. So I thought those two governors would be interesting to say a few things about tonight. Not only are they interesting, but they're controversial. Milton, of course, being a Confederate governor during the Civil War, that's controversy enough, but there's a lot of controversy about how his life ended. Most people believe that he committed suicide. Some people question that, but of all of the top Confederate officials, and you throw in the Confederate governors, really the only one that took his own life at the end of the war. And then, of course, the controversy over Governor Katz. There are many controversies about Governor Katz, but of course he ran on a nativist, anti-Catholic platform, which at that time, unfortunately, in the South and in other parts of the U.S., was a popular position for some politicians to run on. He was also very controversial in the sense of many of the appointments he made, accused of nepotism and favoring his political buddies with political offices. And then later in life, after he was governor, he faced various trials, legal trials that he had to go through. So two very colorful characters. So I'll begin with Governor Milton. And what I'm going to do tonight, because obviously we can't talk about these two governors in depth given the time that we have, I'm going to focus on their elections to be governor. So John Milton was elected in 1860, and Governor Katz was elected in 1916. So just a tiny little bit of background about Governor Milton. He was born in Georgia but moved to Florida in 1845. He had family relations here in Florida over in Jackson County in the Panhandle. That's where he established a plantation, and that's where he established his political base. In Jackson County, it was a county dominated by conservative Whigs. He was one of the few leading Democratic politicians in that area of Florida. So that kind of made him stand out a bit. He was an attorney and a landowner, and of course, a slave owner as well. And he served in the Florida House of Representatives in 1850, but really didn't have much in the way of legislative service before, except for that one term in the 1850s before he became governor. In 1860, of course, the sectional conflict between the North and the South was really building. And in April of 1860, the Democratic Party held its party convention, national convention in Charleston, South Carolina. And the Florida delegation was led by John Milton. They had a vote. They picked Milton to lead the delegation. And I think not only because of some of his experience in the legislature, but like Sidney Catts, Milton was a well-known, well-noted orator. So his speaking abilities had a lot to do with why he was selected to lead the delegation. So in Charleston, he's leading the Florida delegation. Of course, as we know there was a split in the Democratic Party. The diehard secessionists, or diehard disunionists, if you will, were saying that they wouldn't accept anything less than allowing a total expansion of slavery into the territories that had been acquired by Mexico after that war. And Florida was one of the southern states that left the convention when that position was not taken. And so they returned to Florida at the end of May 1860, but Milton gained a lot of notoriety, a lot of attention for his leadership of the Florida delegation. And in June of 1860, they held the Democratic State Convention in Quincy, Florida, which is actually where I live. It's kind of hard to think now that they would have the Democratic Convention in Quincy, but Quincy was an important town. Of course, North Florida was the center of economic and political power in the state at that time. And so they had the state convention in Quincy to nominate a gubernatorial candidate for the upcoming election, and John Milton was nominated, but not very easily. It took 23 ballots for him to be chosen as the Democratic Party's nominee. Nevertheless, he did become the nominee, and in the late summer and early fall, he's hitting the campaign trail around Florida. During this campaign in 1860, he was opposed by Edward Hopkins of Jacksonville. He led the Constitutional Union Party, which was a party made up mostly of old Whigs whose major concern was to keep the Union together. Obviously, as we know, the Republicans with Abraham Lincoln were calling for keeping the Union together but not allowing slavery to expand into the Western territories. And Milton and the more radical Democrats were calling for, maybe secession if the U.S. did not go along with their position on the expansion of slavery. So Hopkins and Milton are on the campaign trail. Two main issues came up. Obviously, the first issue was whether there's going to be a split between the North and the South. A lot of people, of course, accused Milton of being a disunionist. He said, well, I'm not a disunion, I'm for union. I just believe that it's constitutional for us to be able to move slavery into the Western territories, and I'm trying to keep the southern states together in opposition to the North. That was his political position. On a personal level, some things about Milton's past came up during this election. It was brought up that while Milton was a young man, a young attorney in Columbus, Georgia, he had shot and killed a man in August of 1833. Now, without going into a lot of detail about Georgia politics at that time, Milton had been a supporter of nullification, where, the idea that John Calhoun came up with that states would be able to nullify a federal law that they thought was unconstitutional. He supported that position and ran for Congress in 1832 as a nullification candidate. The popularity of nullification was not as great in Georgia by any means as it was in South Carolina, and he was defeated. In fact, he garnered the fewest votes of any candidate during that election. So a lot of people made fun of Milton, a lot of people who were against nullification. He had a lot of political enemies by that time, and one of these enemies, a Major Joseph Camp, he was a major in the Georgia militia, was a well-known duelist. He had killed a prominent political leader in Columbus just the year before in a duel, and word got out that he was gunning for Milton. Milton also was upset that an anonymous letter was published in the local newspaper. He blamed it on Camp, and in that letter, Milton was accused of adultery. Well, Milton decided to take the affair into his own hands, and in August of 1833, he heard that Camp was downtown in Columbus looking for him, so he grabbed a shotgun, went out and shot him down in the street. It wasn't a duel, it was just an outright killing, but unbelievably, and there were many witnesses, Milton was acquitted of that crime. And the reason he was acquitted is because of politics. By that time, Milton had other supporters among the nullification camp, many of whom were in kind of the upper echelons in the legal system around Columbus. So the judge and many of the jurors were sympathetic to Milton, and he was acquitted. But this Milton Camp affair, as it was called, became national news. If you look at old newspapers from back then, not only was it covered in Georgia and Florida, but it was covered, in New York and Pennsylvania and across the country. So Milton has to deal with that question. Fortunately for him, one of the prosecuting attorneys had written a letter in 1833 saying, I looked at the evidence again. I don't believe Milton was guilty of this. I was wrong in my initial opinion. He published that letter in some Georgia newspapers in 1838. Well, lo and behold, Milton and his followers in 1860 published that letter in Florida newspapers saying, look, this guy was one of the prosecutors. He says I'm not guilty. Let's put this issue to rest. I guess that was enough to put the issue to rest, because when the vote was taken in October of 1861, Milton won the election by about 1,700 votes against Edward Hopkins and became the next governor of Florida. Unfortunately for Milton, the Florida Constitution at the time did not allow him to take office, just a few months away, because of things that had happened in 1845 when we had our first state governor. He had to wait a year. So he's elected in October of 1860, but he doesn't take office until October of 1861. So he was he had to wait around all that time, and of course the Civil War has begun. He's itching to get in office, but can't do that until October of 1861. And he does come into office, and one of the notable things about Milton's inauguration is the fact that if you look at all of our governors, all the state under statehood from 1845 up to Governor DeSantis, they're all copies of their inaugural address, which that seems pretty obvious. Well, in the case of Governor Milton, there isn't a copy. There's not one in the state archives. There's not one in any archive that I've ever found. So just another kind of weird thing about Milton. It was lost. His family plantation burned down in the 1870s. If there was a copy, probably went up in that fire. But just to move along now, since I want to get to Katz, Milton, as I mentioned when I started talking about him, the other big controversy about Milton was his death, the nature of his death. On October 1st, 1865, he went home to his plantation outside of Marianna in Jackson County, and he did that a lot during the war years. He had a place at a hotel across from the Capitol building in Tallahassee, but he had a large family, and his family stayed back on the plantation for most of the time during the war. Well, he left Tallahassee at the end of March, went to the plantation, and on April 1st, a gunshot was heard down in his study. Supposedly his son went in to check on him, and the governor was dead. Most historians believe, and it seems pretty obvious, that he committed suicide. However, there wasn't anybody else in the room. There was no suicide note. It could have been accidental. Richmond had not yet fallen. It fell on April 2nd, 1865. Obviously, the Confederacy was going to lose. But you could argue that Milton hadn't gotten that news yet. Again, just a mystery about Milton, one of the things that I think makes him an interesting governor to look at. So let me move on to Sidney Catts. Catts was born in Alabama in 1863. His family was, a middle-class farming family. Katz attended Auburn University, but he didn't complete his degree. He went on to Cumberland University and received a law degree. And it's interesting that Katz received the law degree there, as did Governor Collins, and as did St. Petersburg's own Governor Christ from Cumberland University. Sidney Catts became an attorney, but as a young man in his early 20s, he had a religious revelation. He became consumed by following Jesus Christ and became a Baptist preacher. So he's a Baptist preacher in Alabama there before the turn of the century. He also delved in business and so forth. But in 1911, he took up the opportunity to become the pastor of the Baptist Church in Defuniak Springs in Walton County, Florida. He stayed as pastor there for some time. However, he didn't feel like he was making enough money to feed his large family, so he became an insurance salesman at the same time. And that those two occupations, being a Baptist minister and an insurance salesman, allowed him to go from town to town in the panhandle of Florida and down into some other areas of towards central Florida. And he became known by many of the rural politicians and leaders in that part of the state. So he had already been interested in politics. In fact, he had run for Congress in Alabama, but had failed in 2 attempts to be elected to Congress. But by 1914, he was already planning to run as governor in 1916. And so in 1916, he declared his candidacy, but of course he was a long shot. He was way outside of the establishment. The main candidates were led by William Knott, who was the comptroller of the state. Other candidates included Ian Ferris, who Governor Ferris Bryant was actually related to. Ferris had been Speaker of the House, so the point is that these were establishment politicians, establishment Democratic politicians that Katz was facing. So Katz knew that he wasn't going to garner a lot of votes in the city. Those would be dominated by these establishment politicians. So he ran a rural campaign. And one of the things that stood out among many things about Katz, besides his oratory, was the fact that in this campaign, his supporters had bought him a Model T Ford. And in Florida at that time, there were only 17,000 registered automobile owners. So you can imagine having this Model T Ford come in with a loudspeaker blaring, about Sidney Catts. This was very exciting fare for people in small rural towns in Florida. Katz carried a message, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, a message that unfortunately was very popular in some parts of Florida at the time and in the nation in general. He based his campaign on nativism, anti-immigrant, and anti-Catholicism. He said there was a Catholic conspiracy to control the government of the United States and the government of Florida. He even made an accusation that there were arms being secured for a Catholic insurrection in what he called the cathedral, but I guess technically it wasn't at that time, the main Catholic church in Tampa. So he carried this divisive issue with him, and he also carried a couple of pistols. He was, very charismatic. He had a couple of pistols. He said, some of these Catholic assassins might try to kill me, and I carry these pistols to defend myself. So a very colorful and controversial character. His other big issue was prohibition, which at the time was gaining steam to be, as it was, eventually passed in an amendment in the U.S. Constitution in 1918. So he was forceful in prohibition, even though behind closed doors, Katz was known to take a drink every now and then. So in the Democratic primary in June of 1916, the balloting is going forth. But fortunately, as it turned out for Katz in the long run, during that balloting, for the first time, Florida had deployed a new ballot. And the reason they used this new ballot was to try to end having these runoff elections, which happened a lot in Florida Democratic politics up to that time. And so there were 2 tiers of candidates. You could pick your first-tier candidate, your choice in that tier, and then your second-tier candidate. Well, of course, that's confusing in itself, and it's confusing for the people who are trying to administer this new form of balloting. So the election was just a big fiasco. However, the state canvassing board declared Katz the winner of the election, but William Knott, who was the leading establishment candidate, contested the canvassing board. It went all the way to the Florida Supreme Court at the beginning of October of 1916. The Florida Supreme Court ruled in Knott's favor, saying he really won the election. Well, Katz had already gone off in another direction. He didn't believe that the establishment was going to give him this election victory, whatever may come. So he joined forces with a small third party, the Prohibition Party, and became its nominee in the election of 1916. And not only did he have this, his speaking and the anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant issue that he kept pushing, these fiery issues, but he also could say, hey, the establishment has denied my rightful victory. They're trying to impose their will on you, the common man and woman, and the rural people of our great state. So using that ammunition, and he had a lot of it, Katz went on to win a victory in the general election. He beat Knott's 39,000 to 30,000 votes, and in January of 1917, he was elected governor. And that inauguration stands out, too, just like many things stand out, with Sidney Johnson Catts, who, by the way, was named for Albert Sidney Johnson, a famous Confederate general. It was the first inauguration that was filmed. So if you go to the Florida Memory website through the Florida State Archives, you can watch the inauguration parade, and you can watch, of course, it's all silent, of course, and you can watch Katz giving his acceptance speech. So another first coming with this governor. Katz was not done with politics. In 1920, he ran for the U.S. Senate. He failed in that race. In 1924, he ran again for governor. He failed, although he did pretty well. And in 1928, he failed for a third time, or a second time, if you will, running for governor. Last thing I'll say about that 1928 campaign is that is the year, of course, when Al Smith, the Catholic wet candidate, who was, against prohibition, was the nominee of the Democratic Party. Katz, being a prohibitionist, being very anti-Catholic, he came out in public and spoke out against Al Smith. And of course, well, whether Katz's voice had anything to do with Smith's defeat in that campaign, who knows? But as we know, Herbert Hoover was elected. Sidney Catts, his colorful career finally came to an end on March 9th, 1936, when he died at his home in Defuniak Springs in Walton County, Florida. So those are the two governors I had focused on tonight, and I'll turn it over to Bob.
Well, thank you, Boyd. Good evening, everybody. Governor, Mrs. Martinez, distinguished guests, thanks for coming out. We certainly appreciate it. I'll have to confess right up front that I'm a little intimidated tonight because we have in the room Dr. Gary Mormino, the preeminent historian of the state of Florida. My chances of making an error tonight are probably pretty good, and it is possible to retroactively go back and change course grades. So bear with me. Now, mine is a tale of three governors, though we certainly won't have time to go through all three of them in great detail. And my first is a fellow named Dan McCarty. That name probably doesn't ring a bell. Why did I get interested in Dan McCarty when most of my work is in 19th century Florida history? Well, I grew up in a little town called Fort Pierce. Anybody know Fort Pierce? Have you been to Fort Pierce, ma'am?
I've driven through it.
Very wise. Anyhow, Dan McCarty was from Fort Pierce. And if you grew up there, like I did in the 70s, I attended Dan McCarty Middle School, drove on Dan McCarty Memorial Highway, which was US 1, and saw for many, many years the McCarty home, which was on a high bluff overlooking the Indian River. Unfortunately, it was torn down just a few years ago. The family was very prominent. And so I said, okay, I'll take a look at this man whose name has been around my life since almost, since middle school. Well, Dan McCarty, again, was born in St. Lucie County. Came from a family of ranchers and grove owners. He loved the outdoors. He loved working in agriculture. He would attend the University of Florida and be in the College of Agriculture, which I believe that building is still called the McCarty Building up there. But he had a yen for public service. He would run and win a seat in the Florida legislature, and by the age of 29 was the Speaker of the Florida House, youngest in Florida history at that point. So things were going very well for him. And then something called World War II happened. In college, he'd taken ROTC like most young men had, and soon found himself on a all-expense-paid trip to Europe as an artillery officer. He would serve some 15 months overseas and saw quite a bit of combat. Came home, 1945, early 1946, and like so many of that World War II generation, Dan McCarty looked around and asked the question, why are things the way they are? Why can't they be different? Why can't they be better? And don't tell me this is the way we've always done it. So he immediately gets back into politics. His ultimate goal, be governor. There had never been a governor from South Florida, southeastern Florida. He had a lot going for him. He was bright. He was ambitious. He was war record, which was very important in those days, still is. And the fact that he had a business background. He could argue that the government of the state of Florida should be run like a business and not sort of a haphazard thing, which has been the case in many governors of the past. One of his best friends in politics was a young man named LeRoy Collins. They were very close, had a lot in common, and both were looking at the governor's mansion. But the decision was made by 1952 that it would be Dan McCarty's turn first. McCarty was better known. He had a better semi-organization around the state. So LeRoy Collins said, I will stay in the background, and of course I'll be a supporter of you and your ideas all the way. Well, in 1952, he had run a campaign and would be very successful. Though that campaign was not without controversy. One of the charges made against young Dan McCarty, he was barely in his 40s, is that he had a serious heart condition and that he might not survive being governor. To this day, nobody's sure. There are people who said during the campaign he had a heart attack. He would eventually die as a result of a heart attack. His brother John would die of a heart attack. His oldest son, Dan Jr., would die of a heart attack. But there are people who swear that that was just a political lie. I was very fortunate in this, and it's very unusual in the work that I do to actually get to talk to live people. And one of my late mother's dear friends was a widow of Dan McCarty's chief of staff, and remembered those days very, very well. And when I asked her about the heart condition, she responded, "That's a blank lie. You can fill in the blank." I thought only sailors knew that word. After all these years, the passions were still there. Politics was hard for Dan McCarty. The glad-handing, the schmoozing, as Mike called it, didn't come easy for him. But he knew it was part of the game. Well, he goes to Tallahassee and has a very ambitious reform program. He's going to bring in honest, capable people in various departments, and he's going to wage war on fraud, on waste, and of course corruption. And he would do this in numerous ways. One of the biggest problems for Florida in the early 1950s was illegal gambling. In fact, the racetracks, dog tracks were filled with people called bookmakers. And that's not somebody who binds books for a living. If you're not sure what a bookmaker is, after the talk tonight, you can ask Dr. Murphree here, who can explain it to you. He's had some experience. I, of course, never have. No problem. Looking out for you, friend. Well, McCarty, as governor, would inform Florida sheriffs, if you don't deal with these bookmakers and these illegal gamblers and put them out of work, I'm going to put you out of work. And at one point, some 300 known bookmakers were kicked out of South Florida racetracks. Unfortunately, they didn't go very far. But they let to know that there's a new boss in Tallahassee. Dan McCarty would be interested in a lot of things that I won't go into in great detail. He thought that making Florida a good destination for business made a lot of sense in the post-World War II era. For example, he would lay the foundations for the move of major insurance companies to Jacksonville. And if you know Jacksonville, that is an insurance city, that and the U.S. Navy. He got very interested in something called public television. He carried on a correspondence with New York Governor Tom Dewey about how New York had set up a public television system and how that might be nice for Florida. He didn't get to finish it, but he's doing that. He's an environmentalist before anybody knew what that was. He refused to let people explore for oil in the Everglades, which had just become a national park, 1947. He was against offshore drilling. Unfortunately, in February of 1953, he would suffer a major heart attack while in the governor's mansion. Now, according to his brother, the cause of this heart attack was a ferocious argument that he had with Florida Senate President Charlie Johns. We'll get to Charlie in a little bit. Charlie Johns, among other things, ran an insurance business from his hometown in Stark, Florida. And Senator Johns didn't understand why state employees shouldn't buy insurance from his company. Eventually, he would sell insurance policies to every member of the Highway Patrol and every game warden in the state. Governor McCarty thought that there might be a conflict of interest there. Well, they had this fight, and it brought on the heart attack. Dan McCarty stopped being an effective governor at that point. In fact, while he was trying to recover, he would sit on the back porch of the governor's mansion with a .22 rifle, taking pot shots at whatever he could see. Hopefully, just birds and squirrels, and not people like Charlie Johns. Well, he carried on. His State of the State address was read by the Secretary of State, and he slowly recovered. Again, he stopped smoking, which was very important. Well, by September of 1953, he felt good enough to participate in a Shriners Parade in Tallahassee. Now, a lesson I've learned in my life is that the body always wins in these cases, that you can have a health condition, but you can't will yourself past it. You can't tough yourself past it. Well, Dan McCarty thought he could. He went out and sat in an open convertible during this parade. It was a cold day. Rained. He caught a very bad cold, borderline pneumonia. For somebody in his weakened condition, death sentence. He would die in September of 1953. And his chief of staff, his people, for many years would shake their heads and say, oh, what might have been if Dan could have had his 4 years. How different Florida would have been. Well, people might die, but ideas don't. Now, Florida didn't have a lieutenant governor when Dan McCarty died. They didn't feel we needed one. In case of the unlikely event that a governor would die, the Senate president would automatically become acting governor. And that just happened to be Charlie Johns. Now, again, a question you might ask is, well, gee, Dr. Taylor, why did you write about Charlie Johns? Well, his story and Dan McCarty's story are very closely connected. And to be brutally honest, nobody else wanted to write about Charlie Johns. There were no line of volunteers. And part of the problem was, later in his career, Charlie Johns would chair something called the Johns Committee in the Florida legislature, which investigated civil rights workers, gay people, liberal professors, and anybody they didn't like. And they would do this with all the finesse and grace of the Gestapo. Well, during his short-acting governorship, that wasn't an issue. Well, who is this fellow? Again, he's from Stark. Came from a family very interested in public service. His father was a police officer who was killed in Nassau County. His older brother was a member of the Florida Senate. And young Charlie's dream was to be in that body and maybe be Senate president. Well, he wanted to go to college, but it wasn't going to happen in the 19-teens. And to this day, the folks at the University of Florida are not sure if Charlie Johns actually attended or not. If he was there, he wasn't there very long. We'll probably never know. So he has to go to work. And he ended up going to work for the railroad. And he would become a railroad conductor. And Charlie Johns would always say, you know, this was the best political training anybody could ever have. Because you deal with people every day. And you deal with people's problems every day. Well, he would prosper. Again, he would have the insurance business. At one point, he owned an ice house, which I imagine in Florida is probably a pretty good business. And got himself into the Florida legislature, into the Senate, and would become, by Dan McCarty's death, the Senate president. Now, Charlie Johns was a charter member of something called the Pork Chop Gang. And this does not mean people who were addicted to pork products. These were old school Florida politicians who thought that the good old days of the Gilded Age should not end. And that things like ethics, morality, honesty in government were not marginally significant. Which means grab everything you can. Well, Charlie thought that was the way business was done. He's not a do-gooder reformer. And as soon as he got into office, was sworn in, he would begin putting his stamp on the office. For example, all of McCarty's staff and his assistants, they promptly quit. They wouldn't work for him. Many of Dan McCarty's appointees would either be removed from office, a big scandal, or have their commissions not signed by the new governor. And naturally, when these positions were open, Governor Johns would fill them with friends and supporters. That's how things were done. He's building a political organization. He'd like to stay governor. And of course, if some hands got caught in the till, well, that's the price of doing business. The gambling community seemed very happy that Charlie Johns was now governor. The heat's off. Allegedly, there were phone calls between the acting governor and prominent members of the gaming community about how he would not disrupt or cause them any difficulties. And his argument was, and you could sort of understand it, if people can't come to Florida and gamble, they're going to go down to Havana, or they're going to go to this place called Las Vegas. So if they're going to, feed their money, why not have it be here? The new sheriff's in town. Now, Charlie Johns was not an environmentalist, to say the least. He thought that offshore oil drilling in Florida was a fantastic idea, wanted it done, gave leases in the Gulf Coast. He thought that looking forward in the Everglades was a fine idea. And Charlie Johns would say that that oil was liquid gold, and it's God's gift to the people of Florida. How can I not extract this God-given gold and use it for the widows and orphans of our state? Now, maybe he believed it. By an amazing coincidence, the oil company that was going to do some exploratory drilling near and in the Everglades, Charlie Johns owned 100 shares of stock in that company. I'm sure he must have just forgotten that he'd purchased it. Well, almost immediately, the anti-Johns forces, the supporters of Dan McCarty, began rallying. And who are they going to rally against to replace, hopefully, this fellow? Well, Dan McCarty's brother John was all raring to go. So was LeRoy Collins. Eventually, Collins would win out. He would be the stronger candidate. He was best suited to carry on the McCarty legacy of reform and progressive change in Florida, and hopefully get Charlie Johns and his crew out of Tallahassee. Wouldn't be easy. Johns was not going to give up without a fight. And one of the things that would make the election in 1954 so interesting is they had a gubernatorial debate, and it was held on television. A television station in Miami. First time in Florida history. Charlie Johns and LeRoy Collins. Actually, it's on YouTube. You can see it. It's worth watching. And the Johns supporters in the Miami area were so sure that old Charlie was going to beat up Roy Collins that they put together certain ads to run in the Miami paper talking about how poorly Collins had done and how Charlie Johns was the true champion of the people of Florida. Unfortunately, these notices were published in the early edition of the Miami Herald. They came out before the debate. Collins used that to beat Governor Johns bloody in that debate. Bad move. Well, when the votes were tallied, and of course there had to be a runoff election, LeRoy Collins would win. Well, Charlie Johns was disappointed. But, he got to be governor. And before his term actually ran out, he would be involved in some very interesting civil rights issues. 1954 is the year of Brown versus the Board of Education. It was the year when the alleged attackers in the famous Groveland case in Lake County were sitting on death row. Charlie Johns was not a supporter of change in that area. In fact, the NAACP begged him to give the Groveland boys a stay of execution, which he refused to do, even though there was considerable evidence that they were innocent of what they had been charged with. Well, fortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court intervened and ordered a stay. So justice was served there. At the very end of his term, Charlie Johns, and you can't make this up, ladies and gentlemen, decided to involve himself in who was going to be the next president of the University of Florida. Now, no, he didn't put himself forward as a potential candidate. But he attempted to, have the right sort of person in charge of Florida's institution of higher learning, and ended up putting more mud, frankly, on his reputation by going farther than he should have and doing things that just weren't very governor-like. Well, Charlie would stay in the Senate, state Senate, till 1965, and would spend his time with the Johns Committee. And his reputation, of course, has suffered. Now, one last thing he would do while he was acting governor. Charlie Johns came from the country. If you've been to Stark, Florida, this day, that's the country. He knew, the same way Huey Long in Louisiana knew, how important roads are to country people. How important roads would be to Florida's future. And he's going to get very involved in that. In fact, he would dedicate the Sunshine Skyway Bridge and found the money to finish the access roads to the bridge so people could actually use it. He got involved in the debate over what to do about a state turnpike. Where should it be? Where should it start? Where should it end? And eventually, because of his interest, they decided to go for something they called a bobtail road. That the turnpike would start in a place called Fort Pierce, run to Miami, and from there would be connected to US 1, which was that way until the 1980s when I-95 was finally completed. He would do something about a scandal with the toll road in the Keys. It seems that some of the people collecting tolls down there were collecting the tolls and keeping the tolls. It's not supposed to work that way. Well, now it's LeRoy Collins' turn. He would finish out Dan McCarty's uncompleted couple of years and win a term in his own right. So he was governor for 6 years, longer than anybody up to that time. Now, LeRoy Collins was a man of conviction. He was a man of ideas. And I'm sure at night he thought about his friend Dan McCarty, about what Florida could be, how Florida has got to be a modern, forward-reaching state, that we can't be mired down with the same burden of Southern history that was hurting so many other Southern states. In fact, after President Kennedy's assassination, former Governor LeRoy Collins made a speech in South Carolina where he basically said the climate of hate and intolerance in the South caused JFK to be killed. If you're a political person, what did this do to his electoral chances in the South? Pretty much ended him. But he thought it was the right thing to say. And he would say this many times. I would, rather stand for what I believe in than achieve, high political office or more political office. The list of accomplishments are just, we could go on and on and on. But what LeRoy Collins did is he helped Floridians deal with the coming of the Civil Rights Revolution. Brown versus Board of Education. The fact that there would be bus boycotts in Tallahassee. That by 1960 there are going to be people demanding service at Woolworth lunch counters. Anybody remember lunch counters at Woolworth? I do. I always thought the food was terrible. They had great cherry Cokes, though. But anyway, it wasn't about food. It was about human dignity. And what he did was try to steer a moderate middle course. If you look at the history of Florida during those times, we did not have huge, violent outbreaks, the kind that would happen in Alabama and Mississippi. We don't think of Florida that way. This does not mean that we were not in need of improvement. I went in Fort Pierce to a high school in the 1970s that was still under federal court order desegregation from the 1950s. I tell people I know what tear gas smells like because we used to have a riot every Friday afternoon. Actually, we kind of expected it. We get early release that day. Well, Collins is going to be a supporter of JFK. That's one of the reasons he was so upset about his death. And by taking the positions that he did, he would cost himself politically. He would love to have been a U.S. Senator from Florida. Wasn't going to happen. He would have a series of appointed positions where he still had a platform to talk about things he felt were important, but he was a prophet without honor in his own home state. Now, people have asked us, who was the greatest governor of all? Well, certainly Governor Martinez is a definite contender for that. And I say that sincerely, sir. I truly do. It's hard to say. Well, in the state capitol, they have the pictures of all the governors. And since we've had so many, and Lord knows we've had a lot of governors, every once in a while they have to take some of the older portraits down and put them in storage. Well, it got to the point when Governor Jeb Bush moved in that the portrait of LeRoy Collins had been taken down and put in a warehouse somewhere. Well, Jeb Bush said, get that picture back. And it's, from what I understand, it's still there to this day outside the governor's office. Their philosophies of government couldn't be farther apart. But his political opponents respected him as a man and as a leader. And this is at an age where people could do that. You know, one of the things that got to me doing this story is how things have changed. How people can not only disagree on issues, but, you know, want to wage jihad on each other. That's not how you get things done. The issues that these people grappled with, environment, roads, business climate, they're all still there. They all still need to be solved. And we can hope for the future. Now, I don't want to take up any more time because I know people have got a lot of questions, things they want to ask. Now, if you have any complaints about the quality of the presentation, see Rodney. Thank you all very much.
Thank you both so very much. Do we have any questions among our in-person audience? Anybody itching to know anything governor related? So the question was, what prompted these two gentlemen to actually put this book together?
How did this happen?
Well, Bob and I have known each other since graduate school. And when the idea of this book first came about, another good friend of mine, Dave Nelson, was working with me at the State Archives, and we were just talking one day saying, you know, if you look around the libraries, there's books about Alabama governors and Georgia governors and so many other states. And of course, there's the great, you know, resource, the Florida Handbook that has short biographies of governors. And there have been, you know, similar works over the years, but nothing really, you know, comprehensive, if you will, if you can call this comprehensive. And so we said, you know, Florida should have something, a substantial book, a serious work of history about all of Florida's governors. And so that was the kernel of the idea. But then as time went on and we both kind of went our separate ways, Dave was left the archives to teach, and then eventually I was to leave the archives to take a position in Illinois with the Lincoln Papers. Bob, who had already signed on to write about McCarty, exactly, said, you know, this book idea shouldn't just lay there. We should really try to get it finished, you know, and revive it. And so I really owe a great debt to Bob to, you know, let's get back in the arena and get this thing done. And I will say Dave Nelson has written and contributed 2 great chapters that are in the book. So just over the years, I'd like to say, yeah, you know, this started this year, and then 5 years later it was done. We're talking, you know, several years, more than I'd like to admit to. But both of us were well pleased with all of the great contributors that we had to the book, and well pleased with the end product.
Actually, I have a question for either one of you. Just kind of more of a broad question. How has the office of governor changed over the years? You know, from a maybe not as strong an executive to a strong executive, and even just the idea of not being able to run for re-election. You know, how has that changed, and how has it affected those folks?
Well, I think first of all, thanks. People become governors in the more modern era, stay longer. The terms have gotten longer. You have more of a chance to do something. What the governor is expected to do over time is expanded. And remember, in Florida, and I mean, Governor Martinez is an expert on this, you have your cabinet to work with. Florida's size and importance. I mean, Dr. Mormino has chronicled after 1945, this state exploded in population, and the problems had to be addressed, got bigger and bigger and bigger, and people looked to government. Abraham Lincoln said government's supposed to do things for people that they can't do for themselves. Well, the governors of Florida, certainly the more recent ones, these are things that they would have to deal with. And I would suspect if you weren't interested in that, you wouldn't run in the first place. I would think.
Thank you. If we don't have any other questions, I think we can just give another round of applause for our 2 speakers. And thank you all for coming out this evening. Thank you all who are watching at home. And tune in next time. We've got lots of great programming coming up. Thank you so much.